If you constantly explain yourself, people stop listening long before you finish speaking. Not because they misunderstand you. Because every extra sentence quietly announces something you never intended to reveal. To the new viewers beginning to notice the hidden patterns underneath human behavior, welcome. And to the returning subscribers already building a sovereign mindset through discipline, observation, emotional control, and psychological clarity, welcome back. Turn on subtitles. Not because this is complicated. Because some truths only land when you see the words and hear them at the same time. Most people think over-explaining is kindness, politeness, communication. It isn't. Most of the time, it's fear wearing the mask of honesty. And once you see it in yourself, you'll start seeing it everywhere. The coworker who gives a 5-minute justification for being 2 minutes late. The friend who keeps talking after nobody accused him of anything. The man who sends paragraph after paragraph trying to clear things up with someone who already decided how they feel about him. The woman who nervously explains every decision she makes as if the room silently demanded permission. You've done this too. Almost everyone has. But the dangerous part is not the explaining itself. It's what happens to people's perception of you while you're doing it. Because respect is rarely destroyed through one dramatic moment. It erodes through signals, tiny signals, repeated unconsciously, and over-explaining is one of the loudest insecurity signals human beings transmit without realizing it. The strange part, most people do it because they want the opposite result. They think more explanation creates more understanding, more acceptance, more trust. But human psychology doesn't work that way. Especially in social dynamics. Especially in emotionally charged situations. Especially when status, confidence, attraction, authority, or self-respect are involved. Sometimes the more you explain, the guiltier you look. The weaker you sound. The more uncertain you appear. Even when you're completely right. And you already know this instinctively. You've felt it before. You've watched someone talk too much while defending themselves and felt your respect for them quietly drop without fully understanding why. Not because they were wrong. Because they seemed psychologically unstable under pressure. That's what people react to. Not just words. Nervous energy, neediness, emotional leaking, and over-explaining leaks far more emotion than people realize. There's a moment that happens in conversations most people never become conscious of. A threshold. At first, explanation feels reasonable. Then suddenly, it shifts. The other person stops hearing information and starts hearing insecurity. And once that shift happens, every extra sentence becomes self-destruction disguised as clarification. That is the moment disciplined people learn to recognize. Because emotionally controlled people understand something most people never learn. The person with the calmest nervous system usually controls the social frame. Not the loudest person. Not the smartest person. Not even the most correct person. The calmest. And over-explaining destroys calm. You can hear it happen in real time. The speed increases. The tone changes. The unnecessary details appear. The justifications stack on top of each other. I only did that because. No. What actually happened was. I didn't mean it like that. I was just trying to. And beneath all of it sits the real message people subconsciously hear. Please don't think badly of me. That sentence is almost never spoken directly. But psychologically, it's screaming underneath every unnecessary explanation. And human beings react to it immediately. Not consciously, instinctively. Because people are constantly evaluating emotional stability, authority, self-trust, internal certainty, even in casual interactions. Especially in casual interactions. The man who trusts himself speaks differently. Shorter. Cleaner, less defensive, not because he has nothing to say. Because he doesn't feel compelled to manage everyone's perception of him every second. That changes everything. You can see this clearly in people who command respect naturally. They rarely rush to defend themselves. Rarely over-clarify. Rarely chase understanding from people determined to misunderstand them anyway. Not because they're arrogant. Because they understand a brutal social truth. Once you start begging for perception control, people instinctively place themselves above you psychologically. And most over-explainers never realize they're doing exactly that. They think they're communicating, but they're negotiating for emotional approval. That's why some people lose arguments even when they're objectively correct. Because certainty communicates more powerfully than excessive explanation ever will. This is where many people become uncomfortable. Because now the conversation stops being about communication skills and starts becoming about self-worth. Over-explaining usually begins long before the conversation itself. It begins in your relationship with tension. Some people cannot tolerate being misunderstood, cannot tolerate awkward silence, cannot tolerate uncertainty in how others perceive them. So they fill every gap with explanation, every silence with justification, every misunderstanding with emotional overcorrection. And slowly, they train people to see them as mentally reactive. Not grounded, not centered, reactive. You can often trace this pattern back years. Childhood environments where mistakes brought emotional punishment. Homes where being misunderstood felt dangerous. Parents who demanded constant explanations. Social environments where approval became survival. So the nervous system learns something destructive. Explain more. Maybe then you'll stay safe. But adulthood punishes that adaptation in ways childhood never warned you about. Because mature social dynamics reward emotional containment, not emotional spilling. This doesn't mean becoming cold, or silent, or emotionally unavailable. It means developing internal stability strong enough that you no longer panic when perception temporarily leaves your control. That's real power, and most people never reach it. Watch what happens during conflict. One person speaks clearly and stops. The other starts flooding the room with emotional details, repeated explanations, over-clarifications, defensive storytelling, and nervous attempts to control the narrative. Who usually appears stronger? Who usually seems more trustworthy? Who usually feels emotionally safer? People say they value openness. But psychologically, they trust emotional composure more. This is why judges, leaders, negotiators, interrogators, and psychologically disciplined individuals all understand the same principle. The more emotionally desperate someone becomes to prove themselves, the less convincing they often appear. Not because they're lying, because desperation distorts perception, and over-explaining almost always contains desperation somewhere underneath it. Maybe fear of rejection, fear of conflict, fear of abandonment, fear of losing status, fear of looking guilty, fear of disappointing people, but fear nonetheless. That's why over-explaining feels exhausting afterward. Your nervous system knows it leaked too much. You replay the conversation later and physically feel the loss of control. The extra details, the unnecessary clarifications, the moments you kept talking when silence would have protected your dignity better. And deep down, you already knew it while it was happening. But you couldn't stop. That's the part people rarely admit. Over-explaining feels compulsive, like trying to escape discomfort through words. Except the words create more discomfort. So you explain more, and more, until eventually you're emotionally cornered by your own need to be understood. Meanwhile, the other person becomes quieter and more powerful simply because they stayed composed. That imbalance destroys respect faster than most people realize. There's another layer to this that almost nobody talks about. Over-explaining doesn't only lower respect from others. It slowly lowers respect for yourself. Because every time you abandon your own center trying to force understanding from someone else, your nervous system records the experience. And repetition becomes identity. Eventually you stop communicating from confidence. You communicate from preemptive defense. You begin conversations already preparing for accusation, already preparing for misunderstanding, already preparing to prove your innocence before anyone even questioned you. People feel that energy instantly. Especially manipulative people, especially emotionally dominant people, especially people who benefit from your self-doubt. Because over-explainers are easier to control. They reveal too much, defend too quickly, emotionally expose themselves too early. And manipulators know something disciplined people also know. The person explaining excessively is usually the person least comfortable with silence. That makes them predictable, easy to pressure, easy to emotionally exhaust, easy to destabilize. And the terrifying part is most over-explainers believe they're being honest and transparent while this is happening. No, they're broadcasting vulnerability without boundaries. There's a difference, a massive difference. Transparent people tell the truth calmly. Over-explainers emotionally bleed trying to secure acceptance. One comes from grounded confidence. The other comes from internal instability. People can feel the difference even if they cannot explain it intellectually. That's why some individuals barely speak and still command enormous respect. Their words feel expensive, measured, intentional. Meanwhile, others speak constantly and slowly lose authority with every extra sentence. Not because silence is magic. Because restraint signals self-control. And self-control has always been one of the deepest forms of social power. Especially today, in a world where everybody reacts instantly, defends instantly, posts instantly, explains instantly, the rare person who remains composed under misunderstanding immediately feels different. Dangerously different. You've seen this before. A man falsely accused in a social setting who stays calm while everyone expects panic. A woman challenged publicly who answers briefly without emotional scrambling. A leader who refuses to over-defend themselves during criticism. Something about them feels immovable. Not because they're emotionless. Because they're internally anchored. Most people aren't. Most people collapse psychologically the second perception shifts against them. And once panic enters communication, respect starts evaporating. If this truth is hitting harder than expected, pause for a second and press like on the video. Not for the algorithm. Because recognizing this pattern inside yourself requires uncomfortable honesty most people avoid their entire lives. Comment. Silence carries weight. Not as performance, as recognition. And share this with someone who still thinks endless explaining creates respect when it often destroys it. Because the people building a sovereign mindset learn something most never do. Not every misunderstanding deserves your emotional labor. That realization changes your entire presence. But this doesn't mean you should never explain yourself. That's where shallow advice gets dangerous. Emotionally immature people hear conversations like this and become cold, passive-aggressive, or emotionally unavailable. That isn't strength either. Real discipline is knowing when explanation serves clarity, and when it serves fear. The difference is internal. One feels calm, the other feels urgent. That urgency is the signal. You can test this immediately in your own life. Think about the last time you over-explained. There was probably a moment beforehand where your body already felt threatened. Your chest tightened, your thoughts accelerated. You felt desperate to correct perception before the other person reached a conclusion about you. And from that emotional state, you started speaking too much. Not strategically, compulsively. That's why over-explaining rarely sounds powerful even when the words themselves make sense. Because people respond to emotional state first. Words second. This is also why emotionally grounded individuals can say very little and still dominate a room psychologically. Their nervous system communicates certainty before their mouth even opens. And certainty is persuasive, not forced certainty. Not fake alpha male performance. Real certainty. The kind built through emotional control, self-respect, and acceptance that you cannot fully control how others interpret you. That acceptance is freedom, but most people never develop it because they're addicted to perception management. They want everybody to understand them correctly all the time. Impossible. And the harder you chase it, the more unstable you appear. Ironically, the people most obsessed with being misunderstood often create more misunderstanding through their panic to prevent it. That's the trap, and it appears everywhere once you notice it. Relationships, workplaces, friendships, family dynamics, social media, especially social media, people writing essays under criticism from strangers who already decided to hate them. Paragraph after paragraph trying to regain approval from people emotionally committed to misunderstanding them. You can almost feel the exhaustion through the screen. And the audience watching senses weakness immediately. Not because the person deserves hate. Because emotional chasing always lowers perceived authority. Always. The strongest communicators understand something subtle. Clarity matters. But emotional self-abandonment destroys clarity. The second you become emotionally desperate to control perception, your communication stops sounding grounded. Now you're negotiating emotionally. And people feel that shift instantly. Even children sense it. That's why disciplined silence is so misunderstood. Weak people think silence means having nothing to say. Not always. Sometimes silence means refusing to leak your emotional state for public consumption. Sometimes silence means letting people reveal themselves fully while you remain composed. Sometimes silence means understanding that not every accusation deserves defense. And sometimes silence means you respect yourself enough to stop performing innocence for people determined to misread you anyway. That last one takes years for most people to learn. Because human beings crave resolution, crave reassurance, crave restored perception. But maturity often means tolerating temporary misunderstanding without emotionally collapsing. Very few people can do that, especially people addicted to external validation. And modern culture quietly trains people into this addiction constantly. Explain yourself, defend yourself, clarify yourself, prove yourself, announce your intentions, narrate your emotions, display your innocence publicly. Meanwhile, emotionally powerful people move differently. They observe more, reveal less, and choose explanation carefully instead of compulsively. Not to manipulate, to protect psychological balance. Because every unnecessary explanation costs energy. And people who constantly leak energy eventually lose presence. You can feel this around certain individuals immediately. They speak from tension, not groundedness. They over-answer simple questions, over-justify harmless decisions, over-correct minor misunderstandings. And after enough exposure, people stop perceiving them as confident adults and start perceiving them as psychologically fragile. That shift is brutal once it happens, and often irreversible. Once people sense you fear losing their approval, every interaction changes. Not always visibly. Sometimes the shift is microscopic. A delayed response, a slightly dismissive tone, less patience, more interruptions, subtle disrespect entering the dynamic like water leaking through cracks in concrete. And the painful part is most people respond to that disrespect the wrong way. They explain more, trying harder to sound reasonable, trying harder to prove good intentions, trying harder to regain emotional positioning they already surrendered the moment they became desperate to keep it. That's why over-explaining becomes a cycle. Disrespect creates anxiety. Anxiety creates more explanation. More explanation creates less respect. Less respect creates even more anxiety. Until eventually the person is trapped inside constant emotional self-defense without understanding why every interaction leaves them drained. You can watch this happen in relationships constantly. One partner starts over-explaining every small action. Where they were, why they took long to reply, why they sounded tired, why they needed space, why they reacted emotionally. And at first it seems harmless. But slowly the relationship changes shape psychologically. One person becomes the emotional authority. The other becomes the emotional defendant. That imbalance poisons attraction, poisons trust, poisons authenticity. Because once you start constantly defending your reality, you stop inhabiting it naturally. Now you're performing yourself instead of being yourself. People feel that distortion, especially emotionally intuitive people, especially manipulative people, especially dominant personalities who instinctively test emotional weakness. And here is where the deeper truth appears. Over-explaining is rarely about communication. It's usually about permission. Permission to exist without rejection. Permission to make mistakes. Permission to disappoint people. Permission to have boundaries. Permission to choose yourself without guilt. That's why people who chronically over-explain often struggle with saying simple sentences like, "No, I changed my mind. I'm unavailable. That doesn't work for me. I don't need to justify this." Those sentences feel terrifying to someone whose nervous system equates explanation with safety. Because boundaries without justification feel dangerous when your identity was built around keeping people comfortable. But the people most respected in life understand something uncomfortable very early. You cannot maintain self-respect while constantly negotiating your right to exist peacefully. At some point, explanation becomes self-betrayal. And you know exactly what that feels like. You leave conversations feeling smaller. Not because the other person defeated you logically. Because you abandoned your own emotional center trying to earn understanding. There's a specific kind of silence discipline people develop over time. Not cold silence. Not manipulative silence. Controlled silence. The ability to pause without panic. The ability to let discomfort breathe without immediately rushing to fix it. The ability to survive misunderstanding temporarily without emotionally unraveling. That skill alone changes social dynamics dramatically. Because people unconsciously trust those who trust themselves. And self-trust reveals itself most clearly under pressure. Not when life is easy. When tension enters the room. That's the real test. Anybody can appear composed when everybody agrees with them. But disagreement exposes nervous systems instantly. The over-explainer starts emotionally sprinting. The grounded person slows down. That difference is everything. Watch experienced negotiators, elite interviewers, calm leaders, highly respected individuals. They are not in a hurry to fill silence. They are not terrified of pauses. They are not emotionally collapsing every time perception shifts slightly against them. They speak when necessary, stop when finished, and remain psychologically present afterward. No frantic cleanup, no paragraph-long emotional patchwork, no exhausting attempts to micromanage every interpretation. That restraint creates gravity, and gravity creates respect. People often misunderstand confidence because modern culture associates confidence with loudness, dominance, constant certainty, aggression. But real confidence is often quiet, almost unsettlingly quiet, because internally secure people are not constantly trying to rescue themselves socially. That's exhausting, and exhaustion always leaks. You can hear exhausted approval seeking in someone's voice almost immediately. The nervous laughing, the over-detailing, the compulsive clarification, the constant softening of statements to avoid offending anyone. I mean, maybe I'm wrong but, sorry, I just meant, I don't know if this makes sense. Not that I'm blaming you. Sentence after sentence unconsciously asking permission to continue existing comfortably in the conversation. And over time, this weakens identity. Because language shapes internal reality. Every unnecessary disclaimer teaches your mind the same message repeatedly. My thoughts alone are not enough. I must emotionally cushion my existence before presenting it. That destroys internal authority slowly. Then people wonder why nobody takes them seriously. Why others interrupt them constantly. Why they feel invisible in conversations. Why manipulative people gravitate toward them. Because people respond to the energy underneath words, not just vocabulary itself. A person can speak softly and still communicate immense authority. Another person can speak endlessly and communicate weakness. The difference is emotional posture. And emotional posture cannot be faked for long. That's why people who imitate confidence externally often fail socially despite using all the right phrases. Human beings detect emotional incongruence rapidly. If your words say confidence but your nervous system says fear, people believe the nervous system. Always. Which means the solution is not pretending to care less. The solution is actually becoming less dependent on external emotional validation. That process is painful, because it forces you to confront why misunderstanding affects you so deeply in the first place. Why criticism destabilizes you. Why disapproval feels unbearable. Why silence from others creates panic. Why someone misinterpreting your intentions feels almost physically threatening. Most people never examine these reactions honestly. They stay trapped at the surface level. Communication tips, social tactics, conversation tricks. But over-explaining is not fundamentally a speaking problem. It's an emotional regulation problem. A self-worth problem. A nervous system problem. You don't solve it by memorizing shorter responses. You solve it by becoming emotionally strong enough to tolerate uncertainty in perception. That changes the entire game. Because once you stop fearing misunderstanding so intensely, your communication naturally becomes cleaner, calmer, more precise. You stop speaking from panic. And people feel the difference immediately. This is why emotionally disciplined individuals often seem mysterious without trying to. They simply do not compulsively expose every thought, emotion, justification, or insecurity for public examination. They keep parts of themselves private, stable, untouched by the constant need for external reassurance. That privacy creates psychological weight, not secrecy. Weight. And weight matters socially more than people realize. Especially today, when oversharing has become normalized everywhere. People document every emotion publicly, explain every decision publicly, defend every mistake publicly, apologize endlessly for existing imperfectly. And because everybody is emotionally leaking constantly, composure becomes rare. Rare things attract attention, not loudness, rarity. That's why the most emotionally grounded person in a room often becomes the psychological center of gravity without trying. People feel safer around certainty. Not performative certainty, regulated certainty. The kind that says, I can survive being misunderstood temporarily. I can survive your disappointment. I can survive disagreement without collapsing into self-defense. That energy is powerful because it cannot be manipulated easily. Manipulative people depend on emotional reactivity. They depend on making you over-explain, defend, justify, prove. Because the more emotionally reactive you become, the easier you are to control psychologically. And once you see this dynamic clearly, you start recognizing certain conversations differently. You notice when someone keeps demanding explanations not because they seek understanding, but because they enjoy watching you emotionally scramble. You notice when people intentionally misinterpret you to provoke emotional chasing. You notice how often over-explaining becomes an unconscious attempt to escape emotional discomfort instead of actual communication. That awareness changes your behavior slowly. At first, the silence feels unnatural, almost rude. You answer more simply and your nervous system panics afterward. You stop justifying small decisions and feel guilty for no reason. You let misunderstandings sit temporarily without rushing to repair them, and it feels physically uncomfortable. That discomfort is important, because it reveals how dependent your identity became on external emotional approval. And withdrawal from that dependency feels terrifying initially. But eventually something changes. You realize the world doesn't collapse when you stop over-explaining. People may misunderstand you temporarily. Fine. Some people may dislike you. Fine. Some conversations may end without total resolution. Fine. And strangely, your respect for yourself begins returning. Quietly, not dramatically. Because self-respect grows every time you remain emotionally centered under pressure. Every time you refuse to abandon yourself trying to force understanding. Every time you speak clearly without emotionally spilling afterward. That accumulation matters. Identity is built through repeated nervous system experiences. Not motivational affirmations. Not online quotes. Behavior. Repeated behavior. And every calm response rewires something internally. You begin realizing you never actually needed universal understanding. You needed stronger emotional boundaries. That realization changes relationships permanently. Because now your communication stops sounding apologetic. You stop explaining harmless preferences like crimes requiring defense. You stop narrating every emotional movement to avoid upsetting people. You stop over-answering simple questions from people who never respected your boundaries to begin with. And something fascinating happens. The people who benefited from your over-explaining often become uncomfortable first. Because emotional access is changing. They can no longer pull endless reassurance out of you. Can no longer destabilize you as easily. Can no longer place you into permanent emotional defense mode. Some will call this coldness. It isn't. It's psychological maturity. There's a difference between being emotionally available and being emotionally exposed constantly. Most people confuse the two. Emotionally available people communicate honestly. Emotionally exposed people compulsively leak themselves hoping honesty will guarantee acceptance. But acceptance earned through self-abandonment always costs too much. Eventually you pay for it with identity. And that's why so many people feel disconnected from themselves after years of chronic approval seeking. They became fluent in explaining themselves to others while becoming strangers to themselves internally. No center, no groundedness, no internal authority, just endless emotional adaptation. But disciplined people eventually reach a breaking point. A moment where exhaustion becomes clarity. And they realize, I cannot spend the rest of my life performing innocence for everyone around me. That moment is transformative, because now silence stops feeling like danger. And starts feeling like control. Not control over others, control over yourself. That's the real meaning of emotional discipline. Not suppressing emotion, not becoming robotic, not pretending not to care. It means your emotions no longer hijack your communication compulsively. You choose your responses instead of leaking them automatically. That level of self-control is rare. And rarity creates presence. If you've reached this point in the video, subscribe. Not casually, deliberately. Because building a sovereign mindset means learning how to remain emotionally grounded in a world constantly provoking reactivity, insecurity, and approval addiction. Comment. I don't owe panic. Read that again carefully. Most over-explaining begins as panic disguised as communication. And once you understand that, you start hearing people differently forever. Including yourself. You notice how often conversations are not exchanges of information at all, but nervous systems trying to escape discomfort. Some people dominate through aggression. Others dominate through emotional steadiness. The second form lasts longer. Because calmness under pressure changes how people categorize you psychologically. You stop appearing emotionally fragile. And emotional fragility attracts disrespect eventually, even from people who love you. That's the hard truth. Human beings protect what feels strong and test what feels unstable. Not consciously, instinctively. Which means every unnecessary explanation teaches people something about your relationship with yourself. Do you trust yourself? Or are you waiting for strangers to emotionally authorize your reality? That question sits underneath nearly every social interaction, whether people realize it or not. And your nervous system answers before your words do. So the next time someone misunderstands you, pause. Notice the urge to over-clarify. Notice the panic. Notice the compulsion to regain control of perception immediately. Then ask yourself something difficult. Am I explaining to communicate? Or explaining because I cannot tolerate disapproval? That question alone can change your entire life if answered honestly. Because the goal is not silence for the sake of appearing powerful. The goal is becoming emotionally stable enough that your words come from clarity instead of fear. That is what people respect. Not perfection. Not endless justification. Not verbal self-defense. Stability. And once you develop it, something strange happens. You stop needing to convince people of who you are constantly. Your presence begins doing the work your over-explaining used to beg for. And the people capable of recognizing groundedness will feel it immediately. The rest were never going to understand you anyway. So stop chasing emotional permission from people committed to misunderstanding you. Let them misread you temporarily if necessary. Let silence breathe. Let your nervous system remain still. Because every time you resist the urge to emotionally spill yourself into endless explanation, you reclaim something modern life quietly trained you to lose. Inner authority. Keep building it, keep protecting it, and continue to the next lesson. Don't break the chain. The people transforming their minds are not the loudest people online. They are the ones learning how to remain calm while the world tries to pull reactions out of them constantly. Watch the next video while this feeling is still sitting in your chest. That discomfort is awareness waking up. And once awareness wakes up, you cannot return to unconsciousness again.